La globalización como la conocemos sería impensable sin Internet. ¿Qué aspectos de la web son globales y qué aspectos son locales?
I'm particularly interested in the aspects of the web that are local. I was reminded, because I automatically think that the web is global. That's just what I think. I think that, if you are a craft maker or an artisan, you can set up shop and you can sell your stuff anywhere in the world. And that's amazing. That's a real global phenomenon. But I forget that, of course, there are local people who want to create local communities and local interest in their products, specifically looking at it from a commercial point of view. And I was reminded of this when I was speaking with a group of auto traders, people who who are trying to sell cars. And in the old days, pre-web, they would be very much part of their community. They would very much, sit on boards of education, or they would, sit on local governance boards. They would be really involved members of the community, their local community, partially to get people to trust them so that they would sell their cars. They were struggling with this idea of the web because they thought that they suddenly were irrelevant. People were buying cars on eBay. They were buying them from, first-hand or second-hand from anybody anywhere in the world. When suddenly, as we were discussing, we realized that no, it's still very important to be part of your local community because it offers the people directly within your community not only an online outlet to see what it is that you have to offer, but because you're still part of the community, you're still the first point of call. You're still the first port of reference, as it were. So I think that the dichotomy, the difficult marriage between global and local is really only because people first think globally as opposed to first thinking locally.
Alex, vos estuviste estudiando la evolución de acceso y conectividad a Internet en diferentes partes del mundo. ¿Qué particularidades encontrás en Sudamérica que se diferencien de otros países?
For me, South America is such a wide open area because I know, sadly, so little about it. I'm fascinated by how people are dynamically engaging with creating their own content, with creating things that represent their cultures, that represent their communities, that service and meet the needs of those specific communities. Now, what I understand is that connectivity, specifically in Argentina, is not bad. It's surprisingly not bad. It's very similar, say, to the connectivity in the United States, which also has a massive territory to attempt to cover, and even in the United Kingdom, which is a much smaller territory to cover. But what I do understand is that the way that it's embedded in education, the way that educational institutions are very much trying to incorporate ICT or Internet information and communication technologies into their curricula is something that's very uniquely Argentinian, specifically, whether it's through initiatives like giving everybody a laptop, making sure everybody literally has access. Whereas elsewhere, at least from my experience, say in the United Kingdom, the curriculum is very much focused on the nuts and bolts, on how you actually use the web, how you manipulate the web, rather than how you understand the web. It seems like very much there's more of an understanding of the creativity and the opportunities that are available here in Argentina.
¿Pero consideras que el paso de dar conectividad es primero y después vamos a trabajar en los contenidos, o es por nuestras características particulares?
Obviously, access is the first port of call. You can do as much as you can offline, and for that, you can learn to manipulate the technologies. And people often point to Apple or Macintosh as something that has been revolutionary in terms of how people actually consume content and create content, because it is so easy. You literally, click and drag things, and in a service or in a software like GarageBand, you can create fantastic pieces of music with no musical knowledge. Or in iMovie, and I'm using Apple just because it's a good example of this, very easy to use software where you can literally, without any expertise, piece together a fantastic video, a wonderful movie. So you can do as much as you can offline using the technologies, using the software. But obviously the connectivity is an absolutely essential part of being part of the global community, part of the global web community. There's an interesting stage, an interesting phase that we're at right now, because as we begin to saturate, as we begin to have a kind of blanket access, as the gap between the haves and the have-nots when it comes to actually accessing high-speed broadband or even internet connectivity at all. There's an interesting question about rather than just using the technology, rather than just being fluent in the technology. Fluency also involves an element of criticism of the technologies that we're using. And I hope and I see that as the next stage in a digital literacy agenda.
¿Cómo ves el territorio global en relación al acceso y a la conectividad y cómo está evolucionando? Si pensamos en un mapa, ¿no?, del mundo y en un mapa de conectividad y de acceso, ¿cómo crees que está evolucionando?
Obviously, it came from a kind of core of 4 or 5 universities in the United States, and those were the kind of basic infrastructure. But as it's gone global, as it's evolved, the technologies themselves are still pretty much the same, and they are spreading in a kind of spider around the world. And obviously you have, based on your infrastructure capabilities, you have the kind of the exchange, the hub where the content arrives, you know, where it initially comes, and then you've got the spider as it spreads out even further to the provinces and to the rest of the world. Now that's from a kind of a relatively local urban perspective. But if you start to think about how it's evolving, how it's going global with the rest of the world, you're starting to see new hubs emerging in different provinces and different regions. So the main ones that I'm particularly interested in from a government as well as from an access point of view are Brazil, because it has such an amazing infrastructure, an incredible infrastructure. Russia, because it's enormous and because it has an enormously nascent, very prolific internet community. India, because they just want to be connected. You know, literally, it's amazing the way that the infrastructure, whether it's from technologies, the lines that are actually in the ground, the tubes that are actually in the ground, or mobile communications. People are engaging so much with internet technology that is an ever increasing, ever expanding environment. And China, obviously, you're starting to see hubs coming out of China. Now those are relatively similar. They're relatively understandable from the developed nation point of view. We can kind of comprehend what's happening in those countries when it comes to how the technology is spreading. What's really interesting are the countries where it's emerging almost independently. And that's places like Africa. South Africa is a good example because South Africa has a very strong internet community. But throughout the rest of Africa, you're seeing it very much happen on mobile phones. Mobile phones, what's going to be happening with mobile phones over the next 10 years when it comes to how we access and consume information on this technology, on this platform? I mean, I can't even comprehend, I can't even imagine, primarily because it's going to be coming out of those countries. It's going to be coming out of those territories, and it's going to be meeting the needs of the people who are in those territories, not my needs. You know, my needs are being met already with Facebook and Twitter and Google and Wikipedia. It's going to be the needs of the people in those countries that are going to define how the network is going to spread. And I think it's going to be on mobile phone.
Right. ¿Cómo ves que están evolucionando las pantallas? ¿Dónde va a converger nuestro acceso?
I can't wait until we literally plug something into the backs of our heads. But then the danger is when the whole network goes down, what happens to us? We become these sort of fleshy, gooey, creatures that have no free will because the computer is going to tell us what to do. So the evolution of the screen is quite obvious. It's moving to handheld, very much. For multiple reasons, partially because as the developing world begins to develop its own technologies, it's leapfrogged anything to do with actual hard tubes that are in the ground. It's all about sticking up, radio poles and satellites and getting the technology, getting the connection in that way. Now, I mean, it's interesting to see the kind of dynamic and the interplay between the larger screen, the tablets, and how people are using those, and how, the touch screen has changed the acceptance of technologies. It's made it more intimate. It's made it more of a friend, more of something that we're not afraid of because we're forced to touch the screen. But moving from a tablet technology, which is quite large, to something like a mobile phone, again, the touch screens are increasingly becoming ubiquitous. They're not in any way ubiquitous yet, but certainly they're increasingly ubiquitous. But our relationship with the fact that we actually have to touch and stroke and maneuver and manipulate the technology using our hands, in that way, I think that our intimate relationship with the screen is going to start reflecting on the ways that we start using these things to create. And the reason I say that is because the more people who use these technologies, the more different perspectives are going to be coming into the creators of the technologies that we use. And by having touchscreen, by having a technology that is more intimate and less scary, the population is exploding in terms of their use. And so that's where I really see the relationship between myself and the screen, the interface between myself and the machine evolving. Other people making stuff, not me. I'm a geek. I know what I want, but that's only for my population.
Alex, vos estuviste viendo muchas experiencias en diferentes países, lugares muy urbanos como Londres o muy rurales como Ghana. ¿Cómo crees que enfatiza nuestras igualdades o inequidades?
I was most struck by the potential inequalities when I was in Ghana, when we were visiting a very rural internet cafe, and that had only really been connected for the previous 6 months. And it was full of kids. They were great. They were absolutely amazing. It was full of these kids who were just like hooked. They were stuck, right? And they were there. They were opening up the world of information to themselves. It was literally like, taking them out of their local world and making them global citizens all of a sudden. They were able to find out everything. They were using it for homework. They were doing all kinds of things. They were meeting people on Facebook. They were equal in that sense, that they were just simply other people on the other side of the screen, and they could connect with anybody whom they wanted, primarily socially, but they could connect on a level that had nothing to do with the fact that they were kids in Ghana and this person over here is a Emirates professor of yada yada, something amazing. They were literally able just to connect on the basis of football, right? And then they could chat. But at the same time, the thing that really struck me of the potential inequality was that they were literally using technologies that were built by people in one particular part of the world to serve the needs of that particular population. And the fact that Google has managed to spread everywhere, and the fact that Facebook has managed to spread everywhere, and the fact that something like Wikipedia has managed to spread everywhere is a testament to the fact that this technology is so open and so adaptable, so flexible, that people around the world can use them. There's a kind of sort of global humanity that is being emphasized, that people are meeting across, that those inequalities are sort of absent. But at the same time, the kids from Abiru in Ghana have different backgrounds, have different experiences, have different interests, have different intentions, and that they were seeing the world through a window that was defined by Google, or they were seeing the world through a window that was defined by Facebook, that they were accessing information that was written by other people, not them. They weren't yet contributing. They weren't yet being part of that global conversation, if you want to say. They weren't destinations, they were still reaching out. And that's an area of inequality that by signing them up to blogging software, I was hoping at least they would start to have a voice. They would start to become the content producers as opposed to simply the content consumers. That's where I truly see the biggest inequality. Because if you have one culture that's dominating how we see this vast ocean of information, then there's other people elsewhere who aren't having their voices heard and are perfectly happy to consume rather than to create.
¿Y qué crees que se le tendría que dar a esas personas para lograr más igualdad? ¿Qué tipo de educación?
I think it's multiple, because I don't think that you can necessarily have a top-down solution. That may work in Argentina, it may not work elsewhere. It may not even work in every community in Argentina. It's very much, the web is amazing at finding people's passions and then amplifying them multifold. And so in some ways, it's more about a kind of community coming together and, a local community coming together and saying, this is what we're really into. This is how we view the world. This is how I would define this phenomenon on Wikipedia. This is how I would celebrate my national identity, for example. And I would make a website, or I would write a blog about, my cat and what my cat does every day of the week. And then that's how you then start to create the content. Or it could be about political action, or it could be about whatever. But I think it's more about galvanizing local communities and encouraging them amongst themselves to use these technologies to have a voice, to recognize that what they have is effectively a printing press and that anybody can use it and anybody can access to it and anybody can curate that information. And by curating that information and creating that information, you are generating a unique voice. So what governments need to do, if you have a system in which governments are very active and involved in encouraging IT understanding and development in the classroom, like in Argentina, then certainly it's about recognizing that you need to have the technological facility. You need to be able to have those capabilities, and so that's a kind of a bare bones, right? This is how you do X, Y, and Z. This is how you create a blog. This is how you use iMovie. This is how you upload something to YouTube. Real basic bare bones stuff. But then also encouraging that level of understanding of the digital literacy into something that on top of that becomes something that's creative and develops the identities of the communities that exist within these developing countries.
Un investigador en Perú nos habló de los usos y consumos de los jóvenes en Internet y nos explicaba que en general, en las comunidades locales tienen acceso a contenidos locales y a páginas de medios y grupos de amigos, siempre locales. ¿Qué pasa con los países en desarrollo que recién ahora están creando y desarrollando sus propios contenidos? ¿A dónde van a buscar información?
Well, obviously, I think that is very much the role of those who we've seen in other territories play those roles. So whether it's in school, whether it's your local library, whether it's people from outside or whatever, or whether it's somebody within the community who says, oh right, I've heard about this thing, I'm going to off my own back, or with the support of government or with the support of a foundation, develop my skills in that space. And I think ultimately that's how it needs to happen. It needs to come from within. But the acquisition of that of those skills, this wouldn't necessarily have happened in Peru if the researcher had not gone into those communities. It may very well have done, but in the same way in developing countries, you need to have that same kind of system where you have somebody coming along and saying, guess what, this thing is amazing. It would totally suit the needs of, it would totally serve the purposes of you, your local community. Get online, just mess around, don't worry, you're not going to break it. Right? The internet will survive you pushing a wrong button. It's absolutely fine. And getting people much more comfortable with the technology in that way.
¿Cómo ves la influencia de las redes sociales en la participación de la gente en la política?
What social networks have really done, their unique selling point, as it were, is connecting people. That's kind of what they do. And in connecting people and providing people a platform in which to, easily blog or share photographs or share quick messages back and forth with one another with links or whatever, is they've allowed people to create these local communities that, funnily enough, the web used to be. Before everybody got online, it was still quite an intimate, networked, everybody kind of knew everybody else, safe type of environment. And what social networks have done is they've created this very safe environment where people can gather together in local communities. And one specific area that has become very popular and has become certainly very celebrated is where they are, their role in political life. We're seeing increasingly news headlines talking about, the role of Twitter, the role of Facebook in the Arab Spring. We're hearing about, the internet election in 2008 in the United States with President Obama being elected to office. We're hearing about all these amazing things that are happening because of social networks. I'm a little bit wary about giving the social networks that much influence, primarily because I think that we had this kind of social media in the past, whether it was in coffee shops or whether it was because of a photocopier or whether it was because of telephones or, we've had this before. Exactly, letters. We've had this before. What is unique is that there is the potential for more people to hear about it. Perhaps not to participate, but certainly more people to hear about it. So on Twitter, for example, yes, there were a lot of people who were using Twitter inside Egypt, And that was, very important for the revolution there, just to be able to quickly communicate back and forth. But it was much more important for the rest of the world to be following what was going on in order to get other people interested in what was going on. And we saw this many years before when the Israeli government actually held a press conference on Twitter. This was 4 or 5 years ago. And I remember thinking at the time, well, there aren't very many people in Israel at this moment who were on Twitter. So why are they having a press conference on Twitter about Israeli issues inside Israel using this technology? Oh, of course, it's because there's people outside of Israel who are going to be paying attention to this. So I think more than anything else, the technologies, social networks in particular, governments now recognize their importance in terms of, gathering communities around issues, in terms of spreading information, in terms of spreading, political messages or whatever. So they're going to shut those down right away. But the importance for social networks has been to get other people around the world interested in the local issues and the local revolutions that are happening.
Right. Y Alex, ¿dónde crees que la gente encuentra legitimidad? ¿Dónde está la verdad ahora en relación a los medios de comunicación?
So in the past, it very much was about looking to one media or, a particular medium for answering our questions, for giving us legitimate news, for whatever. And people were relatively critical of those sources. So, for example, we were able to identify conservative versus liberal newspapers, and we would recognize that there was a certain political bent, shall we say, to the news or to the media, to the messages that were coming out. Yet we still believe that those were legitimate because there was a hierarchy. There were editors who decided when something was newsworthy, and there were people who were doing fact-checking, and their fact-checking meant that what was coming out of those resources was legitimate. This was, the truth. I think that what certainly happened is that as we have more citizen journalism opportunities, there's more content that's pouring in around particular ideas. What is fascinating about that, and I've seen it at The Guardian where I do a lot of writing, is how much that news organization, for example, during the Egyptian Revolution, how that organization tried to pull as many different sources, whether it was Twitter feeds from on the ground or whether it was validated newspaper sources and things that were coming in. Here's our article, here's all the other stuff around it. And this whole body of news therefore makes this a legitimate source of reference, also the legitimate, the true idea of what was actually happening on the ground. But at the same time, because there is so much information that's out there, we are increasingly turning to our friends to identify whether something's legitimate. We're increasingly leaning on our social networks. We did this in the past. We've always kind of turned to our friends, turned to similar others to say, how should we feel about this? What should we think about this? Is this a real video? Is this, should I believe this newspaper headline? So we've always done that, even offline, but increasingly we're doing it online because we're able to filter out the rest of the world and everything else and just focus on our intimates. We're able to focus on those whom we trust to direct us to important news of the day, or the best video that represents this particular event, or the most appropriate political message that we should then share with our networks. So we're leaning for legitimacy on our friends and less on big media organizations.
¿Vos crees que la gente cree más en un video hecho con un celular que en un periodista de un medio tradicional que relata una noticia?
On the context, I think one of the incredible experiences that I had in my own life with that was during the terrorist bombs in London in 2007. And at that time, it was almost one of the first times that the newspapers and the news organizations were using cell phone pictures. And in some ways, it was a kind of on the ground, as it happened, this is what's going on type of thing, as opposed to the shiny, here's a lovely camera and here's a beautiful person telling you the news and being urgent about it. Here's an on the ground, an example of here I am. I'm in the middle of a war zone. I'm in the middle of something. The problem there is that we exist in an age in which we are saturated by the media, and everybody is media savvy. Everybody is media savvy. And I remember years ago people were saying, what's going to happen with this generation that's growing up that totally understands the media and totally understands how to manipulate it? Well, this is what's happening. You know, we're getting incredible videos that are coming from that happen to be cut together and are published, and people go, oh my God, the emotional quality. Well, of course it's an emotional quality because it's been manipulated and it's been cut together. So I think, you know, increasingly people are becoming more skeptical of the stuff that's coming on the ground, unless of course it's raw. And if it's raw, then people are a little, you know, they think, okay, this is you know, on the ground reporting. But everything that goes online, everything that goes into the media, whatever, has some kind of agenda. And I'm certainly hoping that people are starting to recognize that with the web.
¿Cómo ves el futuro?
The internet is constantly evolving. The web is a many-headed beast. And it's not something that we can control. It's not something that we can regulate. What I'm hoping will evolve is that people will be more critical of what's happening online. What I'm hoping is that more people with different voices will start to contribute to what's happening online, rather than everybody just simply accepting from specific areas. I don't necessarily know if that's the case, primarily because as more and more people go online, as more and more information goes online, we are gathering around, you know, effectively big media. You know, it happens to be new big media. Sometimes it's old big media at the same time, but we're still gathering around trusted sources. So in terms of content consumption, I'm seeing a kind of coagulation, as it were, around you know, the main organizations that are providing the content. But as more people do go online, I'm imagining that what happens with your cell phone, what happens with your mobile phone, will start to change that. I'm not a utopian in any way. I don't think that the internet is going to bring everybody together in a global group hug. That's not my bag. It's fine. I'm quite a realist about it. I'm also not a dystopian. I don't think that it's going to undercut systems of authority and that, you know, we're all going to fall into anarchy. I'm not interested in that scenario either. I think it's going to be somewhere in the middle. We will redefine our boundaries based on, you know, how we as social beings, we as social creatures feel the need to define our boundaries, whether it's about our identities and privacy, the idea of the need for anonymity, the need to delete parts of our lives, the need to recreate a new identity. I think we're going to start to have boundaries around privacy. I think we're going to start to have boundaries around how we search for information and how that information comes to us, primarily because I think people will not. The web initially started as a very open platform that we were able to get lots and lots of different kinds of information, and increasingly it's closed down and we're only able to get specific tracks of information. And I think there will be a revolution in that way, that people will then start to look outside those received services like Google or other systems that allow us to get information. So I see that as an evolution. But again, I think that's going to come as everybody gets to a point in the development of our internet and our digital literacy, that we know how to use the technology. The technology is invisible. The web is invisible. Now what do we do next? And what we do next is we start to play around with those ideas, with the things that feel that they've changed, when we suddenly realize what's encroached on our lives. And that's, I think, the future.